Now the clocks go back tonight, and so we mark the start of winter with the first of 3 ghost stories by Candlelight, recorded at last year's Bath Literature Festival. This week's story is Stowmont by Sadie Jones, and the reader is John Telfer.
On a dead cold day in the spring of the year 1776, William Buchanan set out from the old house at Stowmont in Derbyshire to meet his architect, Thomas Gordon. William hadn't anticipated weather this severe so late in the year. He half expected the architect had stayed at home. Even he was beginning to wish he had remained in the comfort of his farmhouse in the valley. Stowmont was a 300-year-old barn of a place, grey stone sinking into the ancient ground, heavy with the years. He had spent the afternoon there, and banked up the fire in the great hall with apple logs before letting himself out into the bitter afternoon. As he wedged the latch of the door, he reflected that the house would dismiss the roaring heat into its dark and frigid heights, since the weather had turned so viciously. The architect had promised to be with him before dark, and William walked as quickly as his leather soles and the frozen, rutted ground would allow. He could feel the silent weight of snow massing in the sky above him. He was not a tall young man, but he was resolute and had no fear of his slight self in this vast landscape. Ice was glassy hard under his feet. Gritty mud turned his ankle. "Hell!" he shouted to the blackish trees about him. And at that, a nasty wind sprang up. The dark avenue of yews lay before him and Stowmont behind. He felt a creeping unease, but its cause was mysterious to him. By the time he reached the end of the avenue, unreasonably large snowflakes were falling, heavy, tossed upwards by the wind, and then settling each on each upon the rock-hard ground. The architect, his horse's head resignedly tucked between its legs as it walked, saw William and hailed him. "Good day!" he shouted, and the horse pricked its ears and thought perhaps of hay and other horses' warm breath. William lifted his chin from his stock, and seeing the chestnut and the man riding it, waved joyously. "Mr. Gordon! I found my right way, then. Apparently so." They grinned at one another, the only 2 people for miles. They turned back towards Stowmont. The house stood on a table of land that was perfectly semicircular, with the whole county at its feet. Approaching the house thus, William remembered his love for the property and his reason for buying it. And Thomas felt a thrill at the idea of placing his own creation in such a place, once the old house was done away with. "It's just as you described it," he said. "What?" shouted William, for the wind had got up and was whistling and humming in the trees. Then, just as plainly as the massive house was before them, with a cyclone of whiteness, it was obliterated. The 2 men could see nothing but the blizzard. They stood in a featureless whiteness, like wraiths, not men with empty stomachs and cold feet. "My God!" shouted Thomas with a laugh, and slipped from his horse. They both laughed, because they were young men. Both remembered snowball fights and sledding. "The path!" exclaimed William, for the ground was covered and invisible. They began to walk with concentration, seeking the way with their feet, so thickly surrounded that even the giant yews above could not show their route. How strange, to know exactly where one was, and yet be blinded and lost. "About your letters," began William, determined to bring common sense back to the situation. "You said the old house must definitely go." "Most definitely," said Thomas, wiping slush from his eyes, his voice raised above the howling wind. "Senseless to begin a modern project encumbered. Look, there!" Like the sweep of the curtain on a stage, the gusting wind revealed Stowmont to them, briefly. "Good," said William, and they made for it. Stumbling, they crossed the deeply gouged cart ruts of the yard, saw at last the feeble glow of the stable lantern, and took the horse inside. "I should have brought a man up with me from the valley," said William, who felt the need to assert himself as a gentleman. He was building himself a manor house, after all. "You didn't?" asked Thomas. "We're very occupied down the hill, or were before it froze so sudden." He didn't add that his mother and sisters were all the help he'd ever had or needed. He felt the blood burning in his cold cheeks. Thomas didn't see his companion's embarrassment. He had led the horse into the barn and was working at the straps of the bridle. He did, however, think to himself, 50 servants or none, it makes no difference to me so long as you can pay me. With the horse in the stall, eating hay as if it were hot cheese or porridge, and William's mare staring over at it sociably, they set out towards the house to attend to their own comfort. "Run!" shouted William, and they ran. Thomas's saddlebags bulging with drawings and accoutrements, swinging and slapping across his shoulder, the snow ceaselessly flying around them, until they crashed, iced from head to toe, into the back wall of the house, and the stones bit into William's hands. "The hall is too big, I suppose," he allowed. But inside the house, the thick stone walls, the empty rooms, the boards of 300 years, the dusty cobwebbed ceilings, inside, the air sighed a patient sigh, a sigh quieter than the wind that raged, quieter, certainly, than young men's boots. William's hand found the door, and then the latch, and pushed. It was locked. Neither man laughed now. The house stood resolute above them. "Did you come out by this door?" asked Thomas. "Of course I came out by this door." Still, the door was locked. Through the leaded window, they could see the glow of the fire in the hall. "The front's open." William, with the house glowering down at him, felt stubborn anger. Stowmont was his, and he would enter it, and he would do as he would with it. But "Front door," was all he said, at last reaching it. He took up the heavy black ring and kicked away the snow. Thomas, glancing up, saw, instead of the stone lintel, the fair modern door of his imagining. It had a refined limestone portico above it, such as he had put on the service wing of Chatsbury. But a front door this time, his first front door. He noticed William was still fighting with the handle. "Here!" But the ring did not budge with 2 sets of hands on it, any more than it had with 1. "Oh, God!" shouted out William, quite suddenly and with wildness. Inside, in those quiet rooms, the house, secure in its supremacy, contemplated the roaring applewood fire that the small man had painstakingly laid and tended, and relented. The ring turned, and they burst into the hall. "Quick, shut the door!" The snowstorm could be heard without, abandoning itself to destruction, whilst within the huge fire crackled and roared. Both men went to it and held their hands out, the blasting heat spiking their blood. Thomas stared into the cavernous chimney above him at the sparks flying up into the blackness. "A good-sized fireplace," he said, his eyes smarting with pleasurable pain from the close flames. "A cider beef fireplace. Nicely made. I had a notion we might perish, like the early lambs," smiled William. Both men leaned back from the first ecstasy of warming themselves and sat one on each side against the upright stones. "There's gin, ale, bread and ham," he said, "and some cheese." "Thank God for it," said Thomas lightly. "I was beginning to form the notion you had an impractical nature." "Practical enough to employ you, if you're practical enough to realize this house you've imagined," answered William, who did not like to be mocked. Within a short time, the ham, the bread, the ale, and a good quantity of the gin had been consumed, all without the necessity of their reaching the table. "What we lack," opined Thomas, "is a band of minstrels to play up in that gallery, and a couple of serving wenches to hand out the gin." "Wenches," repeated William, taking pleasure in the word. When later he fetched blankets and bedding, he peered out and saw the night air was filled still with massing snow. The horses would be chest-deep in it tomorrow. Returning, he saw Thomas had unrolled his drawings on the floor and weighted them at each side. William brought more candles and set them nearby. And then they began to talk of the new house at Stowmont. Thomas had taken very great care with his designs, and the thin ink lines and minuscule writing took on a glowing life with his commentary. The house, in contrast to the building in which they now sat, was so light, modern and elegant that William found himself surreptitiously wiping his hands on his breeches, smoothing his hair, wondering how he, the farmer William Buchanan, dared brazenly claim a place amongst the gentry. He had striven for this elevation with keen ambition and made his money. He ought not to feel ashamed. Still, his understanding and love for Stowmont came from the time when first he had seen the house one summer's day, seeming to grow from the land. Then he had felt part of it and had only to find the money to take possession. Now, as its landlord, perhaps he must change. The howl of the ice-laden wind wearied and lowered, and then was still. "When all this is gone," said Thomas, waving his arm at the house that sheltered him, "when this old dead thing is gone—" There came a creaking sound, quite unfamiliar. Both paused and looked about in quick anxiety. The noise was above them, a deep groan that echoed. "It sounds like a ship at sea," thought Thomas, who had been on a sea voyage. But neither man could think what the noise might signify before its meaning was made clear to them. It was as if a giant fist had smashed from above, and a part of the roof, separating itself, came crashing towards them with a thundering weight of slates, rubble, and wood. There was no time to judge where it might fall or where to leap to avoid being crushed. They could only fling themselves backwards, feeling, smelling the ancient damp avalanche as it skimmed them. The vast black pile, snow-covered, lay in front of them. It shivered and settled, clouding the air. William and Thomas looked upwards, watery with fear, but saw only the night sky high above, clear now and starry, surrounded by slim struts of wood pointing into nothingness. As one, they looked back to where the roof had fallen, exactly where they had been sitting. Thomas's drawings were invisible, buried beneath the dirty mass. "It must have been the weight of the snow," he said at last. William pondered this and the pile before him. He knelt. He picked out a lichened roof slate, and beneath it caught a glimpse of Thomas's fair and pleasant ink-drawn portico gleaming. He stretched his finger through the hole to clear the dirt away, but only succeeded in obliterating it altogether. He stood up, trembling, and bowed his head to the sign that had been given him. At last he raised his eyes. "I want a new house," he said. "I can afford a new house. No servant, not much hospitality, but I assure you I can." He handed the slate to Thomas. "It occurs to me," he said with new brightness, "that we might leave this house standing and attach the new one to it." "Attach the new one to it?" uttered Thomas, the architect, faintly, as perfection was snatched from his grasp. "Aye, a farmer doesn't tear down a building which he might conceivably find a use for. Do you see that?" "Yes." "Can you make Stowmont pretty to look at still, from the front?" "From the front," answered Thomas. He looked down at the slate in his hand. "I will endeavour to do so, Mr. Buchanan," he answered. The next morning was clear. The two men surveyed the property in sunlight and deep snow, while the house stood quietly at their backs and warmed its stones in the new light.
Stowmont was written by Sadie Jones, read by John Telfer, and produced in Bristol by Christine Hall. Now, as a special treat, we've all of Sailing By tonight. Here it is.